Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the National Review Institute. My name is Adam Novak, and I am Chief Development Officer. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our first webinar of 2026, and what a start to the year it has been. So, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our host today, National Review Institute Fellow Jim Geraghty.
Thank you, Adam. I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. I'm told that the number of National Review Institute donors and friends is apparently like near record levels, which is as it should be. I am joined by two excellent all-stars, Noah Rothman, Audrey Fahlberg. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like these past 2 weeks have been a long year. So this begins our year in review, which has felt like a lot. We're going to try to cover a lot. A lot of excellent questions got sent in. I'm going to ask, I'm going to pass along some specifics, but I'm also going to kind of wrap them up because a lot of them are in general topics. Audrey, I know you said, please ask me about foreign policy. Please ask me very specific, detailed questions about this.
Hmm.
But I will begin with Noah because there are like just a lot of questions about Venezuela. Nicolás Maduro currently sitting in a cell in Brooklyn wearing some very cool looking Nike sweatsuit. I mean, don't say he did. When the US takes you, you get some good stuff, some nice swag out of it. So, one of the questions from Paul was, what are the prospects for Venezuela? James asked, does removing a criminal foreign president who was indicted but leaving his administration constitute regime change? I would argue Noah, but Noah, what do you think?
No, I also would argue no.
Yeah.
Um, Look, the operation, the Caracas raid, was a marvelous feat, a tactical and strategic success. First, the tactics. The deployment of combined air assets, combined arms assets, commando units on the ground, the deployment of cyber capabilities that I was not aware of, and I imagine a lot of people were not aware of until the president acknowledged that we have the capability to just turn off the lights in a country that we don't like. That's super valuable. And it communicates to our adversaries a lot of things. First of all, we neutralized what the press has taken to calling China's stealth radar systems. Those were, by all accounts, operational, unlike the Russian S-300 anti-air defense units, which were also neutralized by the US, which were apparently, according to subsequent reporting, not functional, not well maintained, not even operated well by the Venezuelan military, which is an attenuated force. All good, all interesting. And we had a piece in the Globe and Mail, which is the Chinese Communist Party's uh, propaganda outlet, which, it stated the Chinese position, which is this is a violation of international law. It's atrocious. The United States is being imperialist. But the subtext of the article, and even the text when it comes to the experts they quoted, was you really got to hand it to the Americans. This was an impressive sort of thing, and we wish we could do it. That's the good stuff. The extrication of Nicolás Maduro, who's a wanted figure in the United States, literally a warranted raid. All good. However, the regime is in place. It was not the Nicolás Maduro regime. It's the Hugo Chavez regime. Nicolás Maduro was a bus driver. He was in the right place in the right time in 2013, a thug, an apparatchik in this regime. When Hugo Chavez died and when the music stopped, it was his turn. Delcy Rodriguez, Nicolás Maduro's successor, is another cog in that machine. So too are his subordinates, many of whom rely on, like Diosdado Cabello, whose name I believe translates roughly to God-given hair, which is a fantastic name, and also probably a bit of a problem for a guy who has male pattern baldness. But he's in charge of the military and the intelligence apparatus. A gentleman named Padron, who also has ties to the drug cartels and the militias, on which this regime relies on for domestic stability. Likewise, internationally, its alliance structure is tied up with the anti-American axis: Iran, Cuba, North Korea, China, and Russia. Its foreign policy is in place. Its domestic policy is in place. So while the administration has a gun to the forehead of this administration and is getting it to do some superficial things that we want it to do, it also has a gun to its back in the form of the institutions that prop up this regime. And that is what a regime is. It is not the head of state. It is not the head of government. It is a a system by which an entire society operates, and it is propped up by institutional stakeholders and individual stakeholders who represent tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. That's what a regime is. And that is very much still in place in Venezuela. So the prospects for the future of Venezuela, even Venezuelans, I have my wife has a friend who she grew up with whose mother is a Venezuelan expat, and she thought the regime was gone. She was planning to move back. We had to have a conversation with her to say, listen, the whole thing is still in place. And that was very depressing. And I imagine it's quite depressing for a lot of Venezuelan expatriates who expected that this regime would simply collapse or fold. What we could be looking at is something like a Western Hemisphere version of Turkey or Saudi Arabia, an American partner, nominally so, but which is nevertheless repressive domestically and difficult to defend in its dealings in international affairs.
Yeah.
No, I
Oh,
think you're completely right there. And I just a couple of things to add on this is one Trump world operative put it to me the other day, this isn't regime change, this is head of regime change. And I think it's really important to think about what the president's end goal is here. When he talks about Venezuela, the past few months, every reporter has been trying to divine his motivations and whether there would be U.S. military action or whether he'd capture Maduro. They constantly used narco terrorism as the defense, right? That and then also oil. You don't really hear the president talking much about wanting democracy in Venezuela. So based on my conversations with people close to the president's inner circle, also one other thing to remember is there was apparently a CIA intelligence report which suggested that Machado, her suddenly coming in and taking over Venezuela, might not be the best course of action in terms of maintaining stability in the region. So, from my understanding, based on the conversations I've had, working with Delcy Rodriguez, who's the new president, was a vice president under Maduro, is seen as kind of the path of least resistance to get the president's end goal, which again is oil, which the president has made very clear based on his very public meeting with oil executives the other day. Though another thing to watch is who actually is going to want to invest there because stability isn't exactly guaranteed at this point.
yeah. I was going to say a lot of hard lessons for the Venezuelan regime, which is still in place. My term regime always meant a form of government, not a particular administration. I did not like it when, can't remember whether it was Ted Kennedy or John Kerry said in 2004, regime change begins at home. No, no, the U.S. regime, as in a constitutional republic, is what our regime is, not necessarily just the Bush administration. But among those hard lessons, don't buy your air defense radars off Timu. I know it looks like a great savings at the time. It's going to come back to bite you in the end. I'd like Delcy Rodriguez has not sounded like somebody who's itching to cooperate in a new golden era of partnership with the United States. Some of this might be saber rattling and for public consumption, and maybe behind the scenes she's being more cooperative. Trump said so in that initial press conference. So, I'd like to see that that's the case. I guess time is going to time will tell. The golden godly hair, Noah. I just thought of like Samson and Delilah, that there's some sort of metaphor there that, as male pattern baldness takes its claim, he loses his power and can't hold on. And so, yeah, like I think for a long time, I was thinking Trump is going to turn into the greatest neocon president of all time with his, hitting the Iranian nuclear program, possibly additional hits on Iran in the coming days. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But just it's one of those things where it's very, he's the only guy who's like hitting hard foreign regimes and not even bothering to talk about the importance of democracy, the importance of replacing this with a.
Which is so bizarre,
Yeah.
Jim, because as a strategic matter, our problem with Venezuela is not really the drug cartels, right? Our problem with Venezuela is twofold. One, it's its foreign alliances, which are arrayed against American interests. And two, it's the push factors that are generating a migration crisis northward to the United States. So the drug cartels, if they were eliminated tomorrow, it wouldn't end the push factors, which are attributable to this regime and its maladministration. Therefore, it should be directly in our interests to promote, as the president says so often when it comes to Iran, democracy promotion, because a stable liberal regime in Venezuela would directly promote our interests in not pushing migrants north into the triangle and to the U.S. border.
Yeah. All right, so I want to turn directly to Audrey Fahlberg, the human scoop machine, who, in the course of this conversation, I figure has just gotten three more scoops about what's. But Audrey, you're as plugged in on Capitol Hill as any human being could possibly be. What's the mood amongst Republicans these days? Are they excited with the um, hyperactive, overcaffeinated Trump foreign policy we've been getting? Are they kind of want him to shift back to affordability in the economy? When you talk to Republicans on Capitol Hill, are they on the ledge? What's the attitude over there?
I mean, yeah, they're worried about how much they can actually get done this year. It was such a lift to get the reconciliation bill across the finish line last year. But, in fairness, they did it. They did it on July 4th, I believe, which was, some people figured that the reconciliation bill would stall until like this, New Year's Eve or something. So credit to them where it's due in extending the tax credits. But now there are a ton of disagreements about, what another reconciliation bill could have. The president and Senate Republicans tried unsuccessfully late last year to push through a health care proposal, one focused on health savings accounts. That was after a bunch of negotiations were grew really tense over whether Republicans should extend, expiring enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies. So those ended up expiring. Last week, 17 House Republicans, I think, joined every House Democrat in passing a 3-year clean extension of those subsidies. So what's happening is basically there's a ton of gridlock on the Hill over whether congressional Republicans can advance any sort of health care package. We thought congressional reporters were kind of told that Bernie Moreno, who's leading a new healthcare talks on a potential bill, is going to unveil something this week, but it looks like that's going to get stalled until after the next recess. One of the biggest hiccups is congressional Republicans' concerns about the Hyde Amendment, which of course prohibits taxpayer funding from going to abortion. So these enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies don't include any sort of Hyde Amendment protections. And I've done a ton of reporting on this the past week. Last week the president told House Republicans during a retreat that they needed to be flexible on Hyde Amendment protections, and that totally sent alarm bells through, offices and pro-life offices across the country. And I'll have a story out probably later today about how, pro-life groups have tried to seek clarity from the administration on what the president meant by that, and they're not getting any sort of clarity because, in the White House, there are a lot of concerns from pro-life groups that any sort of abortion-related legislation, even if something as minor as Hyde Amendment protections, which again for pro-life groups have been seen as the bare minimum for any sort of healthcare sort of deal, whether that needs to be attached to any sort of healthcare proposal. Beyond that, this president has been one of executive action on all fronts. And what I've been hearing is, and the president has demonstrated, is that he really wants to focus a lot on housing policy. That seems to be his response to voters' concerns about affordability. So we've seen a few different proposals floated in recent weeks. The one about the president wanting Congress to codify prohibitions on large-scale investors buying up single-family homes, limits on credit cards, lending, stuff like that. So I expect to see a ton more on housing. But in general, I mean, the majority is so razor thin in the House. It's gonna be really tricky to pass anything at this point. So the mood isn't super great on Capitol Hill, I'd say.
Yes, the Elizabeth Warren agenda, as we've been calling it
Right.
around here the last couple of days. No, I'm going to give you a chance to jump in here, but before I do that, I want to ask Audrey. I have no, like, it was never a big Republican House majority to begin with. Beginning of the year, Marjorie Taylor Greene calls it quits, resigns her seat. There's going to be a special election. California Republican Doug LaMalfa passes away, unfortunately. Jim Baird, an 80-year-old Republican from Indiana, in a car accident, a familiar story, octogenarian, street racing. Unfortunately, thankfully, he's going to be expected to make a full recovery, but he assumes going to be not necessarily around on Capitol Hill while he's recovering. Um, is there any worries that like the Republicans won't have enough votes to win basic procedural votes or stuff like that? I think they're down. Is this now down to like 3 seats that I want to say?
It's really close. I'm not sure what the exact margin is,
Yeah.
but I mean, yeah, like the
Yeah.
reconciliation bill barely got across the finish line. They already know somebody like Thomas Massey is going to vote against any sort of GOP drafted bill on anything, whether it's reconciliation or something, the party line bill on healthcare. So yeah, there are major concerns about that. And then beyond that, the president's inner circle, it seems like kind of made a miscalculation maybe with the redistricting gamble. I mean, California, Democrats are kind of expected to wipe out a ton of Republican seats. Virginia, Republicans are hoping to eliminate, I think it's six Democrats in Virginia, congressmen from Virginia, five Republicans. They're looking to make that either 10-1 or 9-2. The Indiana effort failed for Republicans. There are a couple other states where it seems like it's kind of unclear what may happen. But the point is, like the map is about to look very, very different because of the
Mhm.
that was kickstarted by the president's, mid-cycle redistricting gamble. So that's another thing to definitely watch. But yeah, morale is low.
Audrey and Jim, I don't know if you can even speculate on this, but when I hear that Republicans want to spread out their majorities that thinly, I'm terrified of the prospect that we're talking about a nation of dummy manders. And if we have a 10-point lead in the generic ballot on the eve of Election Day 2026, Republicans should expect to have wipeouts across the board because they all these safe seats that they had, or reasonably safe seats, maybe in semi-competitive districts, are now neck and neck 50-50 purple districts, and they all could swing one way. So it could transform what would have been a 10-15 seat Democratic pickup into a 30-40 seat pickup.
Audrey, do
Yeah.
you want to jump in?
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was going to say that like 2024 probably, the matchup of Trump versus Kamala Harris, and let's not forget Tim Walz, is probably the high watermark for Republicans. You're not going to get a matchup that good for a while, and particularly in the Texas Panhandle down along the southern border, a whole bunch of majority Latino districts went to Republicans in fairly decent margins, and you're like, oh, Republicans like, oh, great, Latinos are Republican now. Now we can redraw all those state lines and assume that well, it turns out those Latino voters were really fed up with Biden and his economic policies, not necessarily in love with Trump and his policies. And so, having not seen the kind of progress on affordability, inflation, cost of living, et cetera, those folks are not feeling warm and fuzzy towards the president, not feeling warm and fuzzy towards Republicans. Could things change between now and November? Sure. But when you redraw the lines, assuming that a demographic is going to stay in your corner for the foreseeable future, and then a year or two later, the country's economy is in pretty much the same shape, maybe a little better in some areas, maybe not. Like when it doesn't feel like there's been this great rebound that they felt like they were voting for, that could work out terribly. And so, look, you and I'm old enough to remember 2006. I'm old enough to remember 2008. Republicans have gotten their clocks cleaned on a regular basis. So it's not exactly 98 when impeachment was supposed to start. So on the one hand, Republicans doing badly in the midterms, that's not stunning. That's not, that would not be, that's in fact consistent with historical patterns. But I'm not, I look at that and I'm like, oh, this is being too clever by half. This could backfire terribly. But Audrey, your thoughts?
Well, another thing that I'm reminded of is I did interview the RNC chairman recently, and I asked him what the strategy was, and he said, as you just said, Jim, historically speaking, obviously midterms, work in favor of the out of power party. He talked to me about that, but he said that Republicans have one secret weapon that nobody's ever had before, and that's the president. And I thought to myself, okay, well, Republicans had that secret weapon in
The
2018.
incumbent party always has the president. That's not a new
Right.
secret. Yeah.
Right.
It's also not a
Didn't work
secret
out
weapon. Yeah.
too great in 2018 during the blue wave. But
Yeah.
look, Republicans, it's true that Trump is not super popular right now. But also it has been kind of strange to watch in the past few cycles. There is this like cohort of people, low propensity Republican voters who just don't vote for anybody unless Trump is on the ballot.
Mhm.
So Republicans are going to struggle with that. It's like this weird tension where Trump is unpopular, but also he does motivate these low propensity voters who otherwise don't vote at all. So yeah, a lot to watch on that front for sure.
Okay. Turning back to foreign affairs. Today at the White House, they had the big meeting over Greenland with representatives from Denmark. Didn't go great, as I understand it. From Peter, doesn't the Greenland idea cross a red line? Yes. Forced or strong-armed territorial acquisitions from fellow NATO allies. Yes, it's very bad. Now, I write for this other obscure Washington publication, and I wrote just got two additional ironies to all this. One, by European standards, the Danes are like hardline on immigration. And not only that, if you come into their country, border guards are allowed to seize any valuables you have to help pay for any public assistance you may need. They have advertised this in Middle Eastern newspapers, made clear saying, "Don't come here." There are a lot of places in Europe you can live comfortably as a refugee. Denmark is not one of them. Also, which country has the least vaccinations in childhood years? Denmark. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. likes to cite Denmark as part of this international consensus that we should be following. So not only is Trump being like wildly antagonistic to a NATO ally, he's being wildly antagonistic to a NATO ally that agrees with him on a bunch of these issues. Oh, by the way, they've increased their defense spending. Oh, by the way, they've enacted tax cuts. Everybody kind of pictures Denmark as this land of like Legos and happy talks and very, perfect European sensible, leftist values. And in a lot of ways, it isn't. Not that the president cares, because I think he just wants a big thing on the map that could be called Trump land from here on out. That is my cynical perspective.
Ah, so your theory is the Mercator map theory.
Yes, the basic. Well, the same way that Trump keeps saying, they're sending the asylums. There's so many. They're sending out, and he keeps saying, I think people say they come here and claim asylum. And President Trump talks about them as if they are from asylums. I think he genuinely thinks that other countries are sending their crazy people here. So yes. So Noah, why do you think the president is so hell-bent on acquiring Greenland?
Well, listen, far be it for me to go spelunking in the mind of the president. Many have lost their bearings in that setting. It is speculative and purely speculative. But at the outset of this administration, think back to the Signal chat controversy. And we got a window into what the outlook towards Europe was in certain elements, certain sectors of this administration. And hostility doesn't begin to describe it. There is a level of hatred of the European social compact and the perception that Europeans have a parasitic relationship with the United States from which we do not benefit. And I think it's genuinely held. I think that chat demonstrated that it was quite sincerely held. When you talk to somebody who's supportive of this administration's muscling of the Danish government, you get sort of a tautology back. It's like, well, don't you know that Greenland's a very strategic territory? As though they've just heard about this, only just discovered it. And yes, as a student of the Cold War, I can assure you that I'm aware that Greenland is a strategic territory. A lot of missiles would fly over it in the event of the big one. I don't know what we get from having Greenland as a official U.S. territory that we don't get now. We have basing rights there. We have relations, warm relations, previously at least, with the Danish government, who has been a good and loyal steward of this territory. We have commercial access to this territory. If we wanted to develop the assets that are buried beneath the permafrost and the ice there, there's nothing to prevent us from developing those commercial interests. What are we lacking that we need to remedy with Anschluss, with the creation of the greater North American Coast Prosperity Sphere? I don't understand it. No one seems to be able to answer that question for me. So it does seem to me to be a matter of prestige. It was the sort of thing that was retailed early on in this administration, even prior to the inauguration day, and it came in tandem with Panama. We also needed to reintegrate the canal zone into the U.S. territorial system, or at least a system of protection. And again, I don't know what we lack there. When push comes to shove, if there are elements that are transiting the canal, for example, that we don't want them to, it's pretty easy for us to voice our objections and have those objections seen to, because there's a lot of inducements and coercion that we can bring to bear if we really want to against adversary and ally alike. Nothing is stopping us from getting everything we need from the Danes in order to shore up Greenland as an important part of the territorial integrity of the United States and our allies. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, except for the notion that the president, like you, Jim, president likes big things. He wants his name etched into the history books. He thinks that expanding U.S. territory for the first time in a very long time would secure that. I think he's wrong there. I think a lot of things would shore up the president's legacy, a lot of the good and noble work that he's doing abroad. This administration's approach to Europe has been atrocious. I would argue catastrophic from the perspective of somebody who wants to contain Russian aggression, which is extremely important. It's our most audacious and adventurous ally or adversary, which makes it our most urgent and acute threat. Everywhere else in the globe, I can defend this president's foreign policy. But when it comes to the continent, they're just lost.
Hmm. I'm noticing we have a whole bunch of long list of pre-submitted questions, but I see in the chat Matthew asked, doesn't he need congressional approval to take over Greenland? Now, I remember hearing rumors of this thing called Congress, a second legislative branch. But so Audrey, you're up there a lot. I noticed, Marjorie Taylor Greene had said when she had had her breakup with the president, one of the things was that he was no longer America first. He was focusing too much on foreign policy. Audrey, when you're talking to Republicans on Capitol Hill, is there a sense of, oh God, this guy's killing us because he's spending so much time on foreign policy? Are they understanding this is part of what he's got to do as commander in chief? Is there any kind of reaction amongst rank and file Republicans of, dude, get off the Greenland thing? Or am I, just is that wishful thinking on my part?
I think Greenland, yes,
No.
people are very alarmed by that. There are a lot of Senate Republicans who have been very alarmed and frustrated by the president's remarks on that particular topic. Um, Look, the president hasn't quite approached lame duck status. So if you go against him and criticize him too much, he will take notice and primary you. Um, Maybe that will change. I think we're approaching lame duck status. Obviously, if Democrats, as we get closer to the midterms and following the midterms, where Democrats will probably retake the House, I think we'll see some things shift there. On foreign policy, a lot of Senate Republicans in particular are much more kind of traditional on foreign policy. So when comes to taking out Maduro, there's a lot of support for that. You have opposition from people like Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, but those guys have always been very isolationist leaning types who have always kind of opposed any sort of hawkish moves by any president. Um, what we have seen this week that's interesting is the procedural war powers vote regarding Venezuela. There are about five Republicans who voted with Democrats on that measure to kind of constrain the president's ability to um, have U.S. military action in Venezuela and elsewhere. The president called all five Senate Republicans who voted for that and reamed them out. And there's going to be a vote on that, a formal vote later today. We may see a couple senators change their votes, which will be interesting. For now, I think most senators and House Republicans are aligned with the president, but I imagine that'll kind of chip away as we get closer to the midterms.
In the pre-selected questions or pre-submitted questions, there were a lot of questions about New York City Mayor Zoran Mamdani. He's been in office since January 1st. He's already been weighing in on the ICE shooting in Minneapolis, the synagogue burning down in Mississippi, and every now and then he does weigh in on New York City issues, which undoubtedly the city has a lot of serious problems: crime, homelessness, a sense of public disorder. Cost of living is one of the highest in the country. The Jets finished 3-14. It's just one disaster after another up in the New York City area. So it's a little bit early. We're 2 weeks into the Mamdani era. Noah, what are you thinking of that? And Audrey, I want you to weigh in here in a couple of minutes too.
Well, it's far too early to prejudge the trajectory of this administration in New York City. I anticipate big, horrible things to come and a lot of embarrassments for Mamdani that haven't yet happened. Now, he clearly wants to focus on his policy priorities. He's rolling out universal childcare as we speak on Twitter today, as though that is a fully funded program. It is not. Albany is going to there's going to be a fight with Albany over who's going to be funding that and whether the entire state of New York is going to fund the downstate's transportation priorities and childcare priorities. And that's something that Kathy Hochul sometimes commits herself to. And when she actually needs to shore up her own political position is far more leery of. Those are the things I'm watching on the policy front. But what I've seen Mayor Mamdani focus on, for the most part, since his inauguration on January 2nd, is anti-Semitism. Not just because there has been a lot of anti-Semitic incidences inside New York City and elsewhere. Mamdani seems compelled to weigh in on episodes of anti-Semitism that occur anywhere in this country, which isn't necessarily undesirable, but it is a prison of his own making. He has created for himself the image of him as a anti-Israel crusader, a pathologically committed anti-Israel crusader who will not hear challenges to the lunatic notion that Israel's an apartheid state, that there's a racial hierarchy inside Israel, and to which he is committed to opposing. So he has this image that has alienated the Jewish constituencies that he needs in New York City, whose support he needs, and they are constantly policing him, and some of his progressive allies are policing his behavior. So he's compelled now to present himself as the most anti-Semitic guy in New York City, even though that's clearly not him. But it is funny because it is absorbing so much of his first month of his administration. The rhetoric alone is something that I think he wouldn't necessarily want to devote himself to, but feels compelled to, which tells you a lot about the constituencies in New York City that he somehow managed to evade, who typically have a veto over those who ascend to the mayoralty. But he's courting them, and they're imposing their will on him, and that's how New York City politics works. That's how any local politics works. It is a contest of competing interests, grubby, unsatisfying local interests, all of whom have been fighting over the same turf in this city for 200 years. And that's what the mayor's job is to navigate and mediate these conflicting interests. And it is deeply unsatisfying, especially for someone who comes from the milieu that Mamdani comes from, which is revolutionary, which is 30,000 foot. Big societal changes is what he wants to engineer. And that's just not what New York City mayors do. So this is the beginning of Zohran Mamdani's torment. It is only going to get worse, and I'm very much enjoying watching it.
Interesting. I have some like-minded thoughts, but Audrey, I want you to weigh in on the Mamdani era so far.
Well, it's only been a few days, so we'll see how this shakes out. I'm sure it won't end well. One thing I've been watching that's just been really amusing is Trump's budding
Mm,
friendship with
yeah.
Mamdani. The New York Post and Axios reported yesterday that the pair apparently enjoy a friendly texting relationship, which is just fascinating and hilarious to watch. I do think it's also really important to acknowledge that one of the reasons that Elise Stefanik suspended her gubernatorial campaign
Mm,
is, obviously 2026 was not shaping up to look like a great cycle for Republicans for the reasons that we just discussed. But also, she had called him a jihadist, had leaned into him and his anti Israel commentary only for Trump to buddy up to him, cozy up to him in the White House, basically just stare at him with these gleaming eyes and big smile. And for a reporter to say, Elise Stefanik thinks he's a jihadist. What do you think? And him saying, "Oh, I don't really think so. He's standing right next to me,
yeah.
right?" So I just think that was just a stunning story. I know that was a little bit tangential, but I
No,
think it's important. But Trump loves New York. He considers it like a second home of his. So he'll, watching their relationship will be fascinating. But obviously he has so many fantastical, ridiculous ideas. His new tenant, Czar, housing czar, seems to be a disaster, a straight up communist. The National Review editors had a great editorial on her, which I commend to everyone. But yeah, it's not he's flying high right now, but of course it's not
mm.
going to last.
Okay, for anyone whose audio cut out, I want to make clear that Audrey said that Zohran Mamdani's ideas are fantastical, not fantastic. That's an important distinction there. I understand in most of conservative media, our world, the general expectation was that after 4 years of Mamdani as mayor, you were going to have to hire Snake Plissken to get you out of New York City. That it was going to turn into this post-apocalyptic hellscape. I kind of wonder if we're actually if it. I don't want to say he's going to be better than expected because the bar is set very low. But I kind of wonder if he's going to find himself not enjoying the job as he expected, not as easy as he expected, and just overtaken by the course of daily events. Before becoming mayor, first of all, Mamdani's 34 years old, which strikes me as young. My colleagues might feel differently. The biggest thing he'd ever run was the state assembly office and his own campaign. New York State assemblymen meet for 61 days a year. It is a part-time job. Guess how much they get paid? $142,000 a year. But remember, he's running on affordability. And he ran for re-election unopposed in 2022 and 2024. He's never handled a job remotely as difficult as New York City mayor. And on any given day, the mayor of New York's got to deal with controversial police shooting, traffic snarl, accident, high-rise fire. New York City is just going to throw endless problems at you, one after another. And people talking about for presidents in their first 100 days, they have to get stuff done because sooner or later your agenda gets eaten away by other events that come along and take up time, energy, attention. Your appointees get caught in scandals, one problem after another. So it would not shock me if a year from now or 2 years from now, a lot of his fan base is looking at him as a disappointment that he has not instantly changed and the bus fare isn't safe and state-run grocery stores are not on every corner and all that stuff. So maybe that's being optimistic that he's going to be a complete failure. But I just kind of have this feeling that he's bitten off a lot more than he can chew or a lot more than he can be expect to do. Or at least that's my thinking right here. Um, Mark asks, what is your prediction on the Supreme Court tariff case? Now, I had been predicting, okay, the Supreme Court's going to knock it down. Talked on this a couple times on the editors, and I believe there were a couple, I think Charlie and Richard kind of said, well, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a more narrowly tailored, that they try to split the baby or something like that. Noah, I don't remember your answer from when we did it live down in Palm Beach. How are you feeling about the Supreme Court? Because, by the way, almost this is behind the scenes for all of our NRI donors. Once a week, Dan McLaughlin jumps in the clock on this company Slack and says, there's a decision coming. And we all kind of go to battle stations. So we're all expectations. It's not the tariffs case. Okay, back to normal again. So one of these days, Dan's going to get his way, and it's going to be a big decision. Noah, Audrey, your thoughts on, Noah, we'll start with you. What's your thoughts on how the Supreme Court's going to weigh in on this?
Well, listen, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a close court watcher, certainly not of the caliber of Dan McLaughlin. But it was my assumption based on what I was reading about the oral arguments and the tea leaf reading from the decisions that have come out so far that the court's conservative majority is more inclined than less to rule against the president. I think that would be constitutionally the most defensible case in my personal outlook. As far as it being a nightmare for this administration, that's not the court's concerns, but it is certainly a concern. The notion being that they would have to roll back all these many tariffs and provide refunds for the importers who paid them is a logistical nightmare. But that is the administration's problem, and it's cross to bear. That's the sort of thing you have to contend with when you pursue a nakedly unconstitutional policy, assuming that this is the way it falls. And there's still some ambiguity about how this court could rule. Nevertheless, it would be a political boon to this administration, as many have articulated. The president would get to rail against how his unfulfilled tariffs would have delivered the golden age, but for the illegitimate Supreme Court, and then we get to attack the foundations of the third branch of government, and that would be great for him. Horrible for the Republic, but great for him. And it would also relieve Americans of one of the things that they blame their economic malaise on. If you look at the polling, it's really consistent that since Liberation Day last April, and subsequently, the consumers lost a lot of confidence in this economy and this administration's handling of this economy. And when they cite why, they cite the tariffs for increasing consumer costs. And consumer costs are rising. I think everybody felt it viscerally over the Christmas season, in particular. Consumer goods and consumer electronics and foodstuffs, all that is getting pricier. And you can actually quantify that. CBS News has a little tracker that individual sectors of the economy that identifies where things are moving and where things aren't moving, which is great in the Trump years. I could have used that in the Biden years, but CBS News was, I guess, a little too busy to put that tracker together when we were experiencing
it's almost like somebody new
inflation.
is running the place over there. It's a very big change, you could say, over there.
A little different, but
CBS
it would be
News
great.
is very, very different than it used to be.
I think there. I mean, I think that this economy would be running on mostly all cylinders in the absence of meddling from this administration, which is fueled by a lot of economic misconceptions, particularly among the populist set, which wants to use, we call it industrial policy. That's a very sanitized euphemism for central economic planning. And central economic planning does not work. They want to see an economy that looks like the economy they want. They want to see Americans spending their time the way they think Americans should be spending their time. They want them to be attracted to sectors of the economy that they think they should be in. And it's a fallacious approach to economic policy based on a lot of prejudicial assumptions about what America is, what it should be, and what it was, especially. And it is failing, as it predictably fails every single time. So the sooner this administration abandons its Nixonian idea of what how to manage an economy, the better for us, the better for this administration. But it would be unfortunate for the Supreme Court to force him into that position, because it would just further erode the legitimacy of the last legitimate branch of government from the perspective of a bipartisan perspective.
Audrey, feel free to riff on anything remotely connected to economics.
Well, yeah, I was going to say I don't have too much data on this front, not a lawyer. Based on what I've read, it seems like the court will probably rule against the president. My hope is that if and when that happens, that Trump isn't too intense with his comments and hatred toward the Supreme
Mm.
Court. We've had enough over the past decade of the left railing against SCOTUS, and so I don't think we need more of it on the right.
Heaven
That's all I
forbid
got.
heaven forbid the president say the Supreme Court will reap the whirlwind. Oh, wait,
Right.
that was Chuck Schumer. Yeah, I think, Noah, as you're discussing the state of the economy, it's a mixed bag. Almost literally in the grocery bag, your eggs
Mm.
are much less expensive than they were at the beginning of last year. That was largely because of bird flu and people culling their flocks, and it takes times for little eggs turn into baby chicks, and the big baby chicks turn into bigger chicks, and so then the chickens can lay more eggs. So that happened. That price went down. Most of the other grocery prices are up slightly for the beginning of 2025, which is not great. Gas prices were relatively flat for most of last year, and I'd say since the holidays, they've actually dipped down. It starts to feel somewhat reasonable. That's the good news. If you checked your 401k last year, it was probably doing pretty well. Stock markets are on a tear. But are you trying to get your car repaired? Are you trying to buy a new car? Are you trying to buy a house? Are you looking around for rent? A whole bunch of things are either more expensive than they were a year ago or feel about as expensive as they were a year ago. And I think the Wall Street Journal had a good headline on this where they basically said like over a 5-year span, pretty much since COVID ended, the inflation has just beaten the crap out of the finances of basically everybody who is below, let's say, upper middle class, right? Maybe even higher than that. The rich, of course, are doing fine, but a lot of people still feel squeezed. And unfortunately, this president feels this need to run around saying, "This is the greatest economy. We're in a golden age. You've never had it so good. It's so great." And he too is echoing. First of all, he sounds a lot like the Biden when he says, "You've got it great. You don't know how. You guys don't appreciate me." That's a terrible message to take into the midterms. And if he doesn't change it, he's going to get Republicans get body slammed up and down the ticket. But
Yeah, and
sure.
another thing to add here. I mean, I
Mhm.
sound like a broken record every time I'm
Good.
on a podcast. I say this, but Trump won on immigration and the economy. He
Mhm.
has had extraordinary success, excuse me, extraordinary success in stemming the flow of illegal immigration at the border. Extraordinary success. But the deportation tactics are, a lot of suburban moms are looking at that and going, okay, I voted for this, but maybe it's going a little too far.
Well,
And,
Audrey, not
my
to
bro.
interrupt you, those suburban moms like the border stuff and don't like the deportation stuff and make a distinction in their heads between the two. I think a lot of
Yeah,
Americans do. It's not that they've turned on his immigration policy. They love the closed border and the policing of illegal immigrants in this country. That's what they don't love is the mass roundups and the tensions between you federal law enforcement and civilians.
right. Yeah. So it's that and the economy. And I think people are going to look at Trump and say, okay, you didn't fix the economy. And I think also just, immediately after the election, there was this sense of intense complacency among Republicans because it was I mean, it wasn't a landslide win, but he won every single battleground state. And I think for the, first year or so, a lot of Republicans or 6 months or so, thought, okay, we're kind of undefeatable at this point. But as somebody said earlier in this webinar, like they're running against Tim Walz and Kamala Harris, who are
Mhm.
probably the best opponents they're going to get for a while. So,
Mhm. So I'm going to turn back to foreign policy only because it feels very front and center. As readers of the Morning Jolt and everything else that I write for National Review can tell, there are like 4 mornings a week I will get up and say, "What is this guy doing?" And I will bang my head against the desk, and I will just be extraordinarily frustrated. Maybe one day a week, I will feel like, "All right, good job, Trump. Good, keep it up." And the strike on the Iranian nuclear program was one of the best days of last year. And that, I love to see President Trump getting in touch with his inner neocon. So now we've seen these extraordinary protests against the Iranian regime, primarily driven by economic problems and the fact that their currency is becoming increasingly worthless. I know it feels like we've got bad inflation in this country. Trust me, we got nothing compared to how the Iranians have seen their currency basically become worthless over the past year. Some of that is sanctions. A lot of that is economic mismanagement. A lot of that is the price of oil. A lot of that is corruption. A lot of that. So Noah, you've written about this a lot. It's certainly, and also the fact that I believe it was on January 8th or so, Trump said that if they keep killing their people, we're going to hit them hard. They've done nothing but kill their people over the last week or so. Some numbers 2,000, some numbers 10,000, 20,000. NOAA, is the forecast above Tehran cloudy with a chance of tomahawks? And if the president does not strike Iran militarily, how much will you be tearing out your Samson-like hair?
Yes. Oh, I will be in Diosdado's position, surely. It's very difficult to get information out of Iran since they shut down internet access. They've recently restored telephonic communications, but internet access is still down. Electronic communications is still down. And it's hard to get information out of the Islamic Republic. What we know from activist groups on the ground, the government has admitted that 2,000 protesters have been killed over the course of these demonstrations by security forces. If the government is admitting that, you can probably boost it by tenfold. And I think that's what we're looking at. We heard word from activist groups that, yes, you said somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000, and I'm leaning more towards 20,000. It is an unspeakable massacre. It is equivalent to what we saw in Syria over the course of years. It is equivalent to what we saw in the 1980s with Saddam Hussein's massacring of the Kurds, for example. The scale of it is unbelievably tragic. And this is the regime, which has lost all legitimacy and all concern for its legitimacy, is pulling out all the stops. There's no promise of reforms. No one's asking for reforms, and they're certainly not getting them. This is an existential conflict with the regime's own people, and they'd rather slaughter their way to survival than concede 1 inch. And that's what they're doing. They're going to run out of the stock of demonstrators on this street. There are already some reports of exhaustion, of defeatism, of the fact that so many have been murdered that others are just hiding in their holes and trying to survive. Even if they can't afford food, even if they can't make a living, at least they'll be alive tomorrow. That's completely understandable condition. But if the regime puts this down, it could be another generation before we see the kind of uprising that we're seeing now, which is why we should support it, if by virtue alone of the notion that the prospect of a day after the Iranian regime would be of immense material benefit to the United States. The Iranian regime has been a thorn in our side for 50 years. It has been at war with the United States since its inception. It is the leading sponsor of terrorism on the planet Earth. We commit untold resources to the Middle East to contain its aggression. If we didn't have to do that, we could devote those resources elsewhere. It would be a great thing for American foreign policy, which is why it is worth a shot to execute the kind of humanitarian strikes that the president himself has retailed over the last week. But we get some really discouraging news today from the Oval Office. The president said just minutes ago, "We've been told that the killing in Iran is stopping, has stopped, and there's no plan for executions. So I've been told that on good authority." That alone is a backtrack from the president's statement, where he was talking about slaughtering in the street, and only several days ago amended his red line to indicate, well, we're talking about at least government executions. If they don't do government executions, so if the Iranian regime doesn't apply the facsimile of due process that it has and merely summarily executes people in the streets, well, that would be okay. I don't know if this is a feint. I don't know if this is deliberate ambiguity. I don't know if he's going full taco and backing off here and emulating in a comic fashion Barack Obama's retreat from his own self-set red line in Syria in 2012. I don't know that. But if the president does not execute these strikes, and part of the reason that he's been reluctant, in my view, is operational. We do not have a carrier group in the Gulf region for the first time in a long time. We have 11 carrier strike groups. A lot of them are in dock. They were on extended deployments. They need repairs. Most of those that are deployed are in the Western Pacific right now for good reason, deterring China. 2 of them are off the coast of Venezuela. And it's harder to protect our assets without the carrier group. We have to rely on local airfields, or allied airfields. We have to rely on long-range bombers, a la Operation Midnight Hammer. And it's difficult to protect our assets in the event of an Iranian counterattack, which is why we're evacuating people, for example, from a Qatari airbase that we manage and maintain. So there's just the fact of the matter is that we may be exposing our troops and our allies to more risk than we can protect them from comprehensively, which is something the president should consider, duly consider. But it also, if I were to weigh the need for the Venezuela operation, which is good and which I support, against the historic prospect of bringing down the world's worst regime, then it's no contest. And it's a missed priority and a missed opportunity that will invite historic rebukes from posterity. If President Trump does not take this opportunity, he sacrifices his credibility, he sacrifices America's credibility, he sacrifices America's prestige, and the history books will look on the pattern of decisions and the sequences of events that culminated in this historic betrayal of liberty-loving Iranians, and it will not judge Donald Trump kindly.
So, Audrey, Noah reading that late-breaking statement from the president has left me in a state of the Tucker Carlson confused dog head tilt position. I just can't. So, your thoughts on Iran and the administration's apparently schizophrenic approach to the regime and its perception of whether the killing is going on and what they want to do about it.
Yeah, it's a puzzling one. And I admittedly have not been on my phone monitoring the news or my texts
It's because we're
during this
talking to
time.
you, NRI donors. We give you 100% of our attention. So Noah, on the other
Um,
hand, checking his computer. But that's fine. That's okay. Yeah.
right. No, look, I mean, I think Trump, when it comes to foreign policy, hard to put him in a box. Been unpredictable. I think there have been a lot of wins for Hawks. You mentioned Midnight Hammer. But I could imagine him, I don't know. He likes to keep, if anything's true, and if there's anything we do know about his foreign policy, it's like he likes to keep as many options on the
Hmm.
table as possible. So who knows? He may change his mind, but one thing I've been thinking about, again, no foreign policy expert here, but I had a story over the summer just about how the Iranian assassination threats against Trump have rattled his campaign during the 2024 cycle. We saw another new Iranian assassination threat through Iranian state TV today. It's hard to imagine that that's not having some impact on Trump's mindset. Not that that is what is making his national security decisions for him. But here, I'd have to imagine if he's standing down, it's probably because, like with the Maduro capture or Operation Midnight Hammer, those were two very precision strikes where,
Hmm.
we're not having immediately boots on the ground. He was very confident based on the intelligence that he got that those would be immediately successful operations. So maybe he's just not getting the confidence from his advisors that that can happen, but I defer to you guys on this one.
I would not be at all surprised if this had no bearing on the president's policy, that this was just talk and he was, trying to be ambiguous and then ended up ordering strikes in the next 6 hours. Wouldn't shock me at all, especially given the movement of assets that have been put in place in order to execute the order that the president has been retailing advertising for the better part of a week. He can do it. He has options if he wanted to. But he's also been wavering in that interview with Tony Tuchapal, the CBS anchor, and now this statement. They paint a picture of the president getting cold feet, and that makes me nervous.
Um, it's a good point. I do recall before Operation Midnight Hammer, Trump did make some comments that made it sound like he was leaning against a strike on the Iranian nuclear program. So maybe this is a feint. Maybe this is, by the way, 52 minutes of this chat have flown by. I feel like I've been chatting with you guys for about 10 minutes. So, but we would be remiss if we did not discuss ICE immigration enforcement, the events in Minnesota. I find myself weirdly confident that the image of protesters confronting ICE agents is not going to play well for Democrats. I can't necessarily point to polling numbers that indicates that. I can't, in fact, no polling numbers seem to be pointing in the other direction, but I just have this feeling Americans are not going to say, good job, Democrats. We want to go back to the Biden-Harris Walz approach to that. And I certainly think if you're a Democrat, you're furious that Tim Walz is getting to be front and center again. But I could be totally wrong on that. So, Audrey, I imagine immigration and ICE comes up in your discussions with GOP lawmakers. Your thoughts, then we'll shift over to Noah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of, like I said, suburban independent voters who are irked by the president's deportation agenda. But what's been so interesting is like with DHS and immigration enforcement broadly speaking, there's no sign that the administration is backing down on any immigration enforcement efforts. If anything, like with Somalis in Minnesota, for example, like there was some new State Department announcement today about new visas for Somalis, right? So I think, another thing to watch actually, yesterday, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, it's appropriations season. And they said that they will not vote for any appropriations bill that includes any funding for any agency within DHS without significant reforms to DHS. And so they're seriously like reintroducing no defund ICE kind of thing that's similar to defund police sort of narrative from 2020, which runs Democrats the risk of, like you said, making them even more unpopular. So, I think that's a smart observation. I do think the deportation stuff is unpopular with a lot of people, but Democrats are running themselves the risk of responding to that by going a little bit overboard in their opposition.
Noah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think to overgeneralize about the American public, they like a closed border. They don't like confrontations between civilians and federal law enforcement. They don't like a nosy federal law enforcement. We're very libertarian people. We're an independent-minded people, and it's a good thing. We don't necessarily trust authority, and we certainly don't like being policed. And that's essential to the American character. It's not something to be ashamed of. And nobody, I think, believes that the shooting, well, most Americans, I would say, wouldn't believe that the shooting in Minneapolis was anything other than a tragedy. But it was a tragedy for a lot of reasons. And I think that the reasons vary according to the person you talk to. Where I think Democrats are in unsure footing, and where what I hope Republicans emphasize significantly over the course of 2026, is the extent to which this would have been avoidable in the absence of the activist organizations who recruit and marshal individuals to confront law enforcement officers in the course of their duties, advertise, train, quote unquote, and cajole people to stand between an officer of the law armed seeking an arrest target or a deportation target. That is a physically precarious place to be. A lot of these people seem to think this is all a game. They are untouchable. And we were talking on the editors yesterday, Jim, about a video of this woman's partner who, distraught, hysterical, having just watched her partner be shot to death, said, "Why were you using real bullets?" As though she didn't know. Or maybe she didn't think that this was real. But it's real. It's terrifyingly real. The threat of law enforcement is backed by force. That is implicit in the social compact, that it underwrites all law in this country, that there is force on the other end of that thing. And yeah, that's scary. Good. It should be. It should make you take all of this a lot more seriously than you do. And so I would like to see Republicans stand up and say, listen, these progressive activist groups who are in your tent, who orbit around your political pole, are putting their people in danger, are making the lives of law enforcement more dangerous, are making it harder to enforce the law, and are unnecessarily imperiling themselves and their loved ones. And if you were responsible Democratic lawmakers, you would tell them to stop. If you didn't want them to die at the hands of law enforcement to extract some petty political advantage out of their bloodshed, you would tell them to stop. But you're not. But you're not.
If I had three wishes, obviously the first two would be for the Jets to win the Super Bowl and for Fox to uncancel Firefly. But after that, it would be that the administration's face on immigration enforcement would be a lot more Tom Homan and a lot less Kristi Noem. I don't think the country is well served by someone who looks like she's cosplaying cops and robbers every time she appears before the cameras. And the opening statement that the perpetrator was a domestic terrorist. You say the words domestic terrorist. People are thinking Timothy McVeigh. They're thinking Ted Kaczynski. They're thinking, this woman, look, maybe she was out of her gourd. She probably had very extreme political views. She took a series of actions that put her in that place. Had she not hit the accelerator, probably this never happens. People who listen to the editors remember I also not the cop choosing to step in front of the vehicle, put himself at a certain level of risk. But in the end, I think the administration jumping out. Trump's initial statement was that she had run him over, and I don't think that really accurately describes the sets of circumstances. I think when the facts are on your side, you don't have to gild the lily. Just lay out the facts. I think that would be particularly helpful. So again, I don't think everyone involved in the administration is handling this with the seriousness that it deserves. We are almost wrapped up, but there were two questions in the pre-submitted ones directed directly to me. For Jim, what is the backstory on Authenticity Woods? Well, if you look on a map, you're not going to find Authenticity Woods in a map of Northern Virginia. I will reveal it is somewhere in Fairfax County. I just didn't want to describe the particular neighborhood that I was in. I used to live within the confines of Alexandria, not in Old Town. Not making look Boku bucks over here. But I called that Yuppie Acres because this was the kind of community where the Obama yard signs came pre-installed. The first time I voted in Alexandria, Virginia, the guy I asked for, it was a Republican, it was primary day. I asked for a Republican ballot. The guy behind the desk just looks at me and says, "Why?" Implied that I seem like a nice, normal human being. Why would I want to vote in a Republican primary? So when I moved here to this current location, Better. Yeah, I've lived the last couple of years, other than my jaunt to Turkey, um, Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia, and now Fairfax County, Virginia. Fairfax County has by far the best socialists I have been governed by in a long time. They actually plow the roads. They actually do the stuff they're supposed to. Schools, not always policies. Haley Strack and various other folks are on top of all that stuff. So that's where Authenticity Woods comes from. It's a code name for my community. The other one question is, and it's kind of a flattering question. I guess that's the reason I got in here. Jim, you write for National Review and Washington Post and do a podcast and write novels. How do you manage your time? Badly. There's sections of the week that I'm supposed to be writing right now, and I'm not doing it because I'm talking with you people. But I love you people, all at National Review Institute. Thank you for your support. And I will pitch this back to Adam.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Audrey and Noah. That was a fantastic discussion. As we conclude today, I wanted to share a few updates with you. First, I want to thank you all for your support to National Review Institute over the past year. Our work really does depend on your generosity as we advance America's founding principles through our advocacy journalism. And if you want to learn more about supporting us, please visit nrinstitute.org. Second, later this year, we will be hosting a series of in-person events focused on America's founding principles in 7 cities across the United States in honor of America's 250th. We expect to announce the first events in the coming weeks, so please be on the lookout because we'd love to see you there. And if you have any questions or want to raise your hand to attend these events, the best way to reach us is at events@nrinstitute.org. And if you're already in touch with one of our gift officers, please feel free to contact them directly. Thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.